If Ukraine wins and it does so by neutralizing Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don, we're at the beginning of the Russian disintegration. Most of the infrastructure that allows the Russian core around Moscow to influence the Northern Caucasus, pre-Soviet, it routed through Ukraine. And the only other reliable route goes through Rostov-on-Don. And if they lose that, they are almost let me put this into European terms. There's a Utah-sized desert between the two. So that's bigger than Austria, about twice the size of Austria. No, 3 times. 3 times the size of Austria. Crap, yeah, that's huge. And so their ability to protect, wrong word, their ability to dictate the security environment of the Northern Caucasus would evaporate. And yes, we do have Kadyrov, who's that megalomaniac, sociopath, psychopath, who runs Chechen forces today. But he does that because he has a security agreement with Putin personally.
Yeah.
If the Russian forces cannot penetrate into the North Caucasus, that'll evaporate in a day. And now all of a sudden the Russians have lost the entirety of their southern anchor. Once that goes down, every other minority in the Russian Federation is going to look good and hard on their map and good and hard at the Kremlin and figure out how much wiggle room they have. And some of those minorities have a lot more influence and are in positions that are very sensitive to the Russian state. For example, if the Tatars or the Bashkirs broke away, that would be it. Moscow would lose control of the entirety of Siberia, complete with all of the oil. So we really are looking at Russia's twilight years if this war goes the wrong way for them. So pros and cons. Obviously, Ukraine is a more enthusiastic member of NATO today than several NATO members. So from a security point of view, it would probably be a shoo-in for a victorious Ukraine to join NATO. To use another question, we're talking about conservatively a 1.5 trillion euro reconstruction project here. And that assumes that Ukraine can even survive, which is an open question. I mean, we're all rooting for Ukraine now. But if Ukraine were to win tomorrow and the guns were to fall silent, you got to look at what's left, not just in terms of physical damage. This is a country that has been experiencing a far steeper demographic decline than even Germany. And that was before 2 million women and children fled, and before the Russians started kidnapping children in the tens of thousands, perhaps even in the hundreds of thousands. So this is the last generation that Ukraine could theoretically be a functional economic system. You fast forward to 2050, 2060, and there just are not enough people under age 50 to even try. Well, that's obviously been the Russian position for some time, but it's not like you wave a wand in London or Washington and all of a sudden countries join NATO. It's a parliamentary process that requires multiple stops of ratification in the candidate country as well as in the existing NATO members. And it requires unanimity at least at 2 different steps. Also, you ask to join NATO. Russia tells you when you're joining Russia. So I can understand why a anti-democratic, somewhat dictatorial, somewhat genocidal government would be opposed to any sort of military bloc approaching it. I get it, but that doesn't mean that these are equivalent cases. The war was going to happen anyway. And if all of the states of the former Soviet bloc had remained neutral, that just meant it would have happened sooner. If they lose, the entire Russian government is in danger. The problem here is honestly the same no matter how this goes down. There was a coup in the Soviet Union in 1982 in which the intelligence directorates took over the Communist Party and ran the country until it fell apart. And then that cadre survived into the post-Cold War era, and Putin is the heir to that legacy. Also, in about 1986, the technical educational system in the Soviet Union fell apart and was never reconstituted, and it wasn't reconstituted in post-Soviet Russia either. So the entirety of the leadership cadre of today's Russian Federation is heir to those 2 problems, and it's only about 130 people. And they all see the world the same way. And Putin has purged it, pretty much, of anyone who might theoretically throw a coup. So, assuming for the moment that Putin were to die tomorrow, I don't think it would really matter for the war or the overall strategic aims. All of the people who are left in leadership see the world through more or less the same lens. Now, there would be probably a 3 to 6 month period where the remaining 130 people decide, who's going to be in charge, and that would be some valuable disruption time if you're Ukraine. But I don't think it fundamentally moves the needle.
How would the world look like if Russia wins, actually?
If Russia wins? Well, honestly, that's a question for Berlin. Because what would probably happen is the Russians would get to the border of Warsaw and they would call up Stockholm and Berlin and Paris and London on a conference call and say, look, we know we can't match you on the field of battle. So we've already given the order. The nukes will launch tomorrow at noon. You have until then to forswear all defensive relationships with the Poles. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen with this conflict. We're dealing with a country that is literally dying, and they are not interested except for maybe in buying time a little bit. Let me hit that in 3 pieces. First, and most importantly, I have no information that points fingers at anyone. So I personally do not know, and I do not know anyone who knows. And I've even been to Langley in the last few months, and they don't know. Officially anyway. So there's that. Number 2, the 2 dominant theories don't make much sense to me. So the first dominant theory, of course, is that the Russians did it to their own pipeline, but this was Russia's primary method of manipulating Germany, which they've done so effectively for so long, so that doesn't really hold water for me. The second theory is that the United States did it in order to make sure that the Europeans had no choice but to stand against the Russians. And I could have entertained that as of August 31st of last year. But on September 1, the Kremlin ordered Nord Stream shut down and publicly delivered an ultimatum to Berlin, basically saying, look, without this, you will deindustrialize and your entire economic model will fail. Or you can stab Ukraine in the back and pull out of the coalition supplying Ukraine, in which case we will turn it back on. You have to choose between being Western or modern. And the Americans were getting the hammer ready because from the last 30 years of German behavior, we thought we knew what the Germans were going to do. We thought they were going to side with the Russians again. And then they didn't. Germany chose to pay an incredibly steep economic and cultural price in order to protect its values. No one in the United States saw that coming, and that hammer got put down. So from the American point of view, everything that we could have ever asked of the Germans unexpectedly happened. And so we had no reason to blow it up. Now, my personal theory, and I have no information to back this up on the ground, is that it was Gazprom. Because the order to shut the pipeline off came from Moscow, not from Gazprom. And Gazprom contractually was now on the hook for paying the Germans for replacement supplies at whatever price the Germans had to pay to get those supplies. So, up by a factor of 8 almost overnight. But if force majeure kicked in, then that all goes away. So, that's my theory. Anyway, third and perhaps most importantly, the Swedes are 100% positive who did it. They say they've got proof, but if they provide proof that it was the Russians, then Europe has to cease trading completely with the Russians overnight, because you cannot have a trading partner that is targeting your critical infrastructure. And so the Swedes have been asked unofficially to sit on the information. They've been sitting on it now for almost 6 months. And the Danes also supposedly have information, and they're getting a little bit more antsy than even the Swedes because, the Danes are already in NATO, whereas Sweden is still in the waiting room. So we're probably reaching a point fairly soon where some Scandinavian is going to leak this information out and force Berlin and Paris and the rest to do some very difficult things in a very short period of time. Luckily, the Europeans have had over a year now to cut their dependency upon the Russian space, and honestly, it's going a lot better than I had any reason to expect at the beginning. That is the concern in the United States, in London, and across Ukraine and all of Central Europe, is that the Germans will look for a way to go back to how things were. We're now at a point, I would argue, that even if the politics were right, the economics will never line up again. Most of the Russian commodities are produced in the permafrost. It's a territory that slows and buckles and bends, and the Russians cannot maintain that output in the long term without massive amounts of external funding and, more importantly, external labor, because their labor force is in a state of collapse. So the only way we can go back to 2020 in terms of energy and commodity supplies is if we have the war resolved, or at least settled overnight, and then someone steps forward with at least €1 trillion worth of investment, not for Ukraine, for Russia. I don't see that as being even remotely in the cards.